The narrow mountain trail curved sharply between towering pine trees, their dark branches swaying gently in the cold afternoon wind. Emma Whitaker stepped carefully over loose stones as she climbed higher along the rugged path, her boots already sore from the long journey. The air smelled fresh and sharp with pine and damp earth, but the steep climb made each breath feel heavier than the last. She paused for a moment, setting down her small leather satchel and rubbing warmth into her tired hands. The mountains around her were breathtaking, endless ridges rolling into the distance beneath pale gray clouds, but the beauty couldn't completely quiet the nervous thoughts running through her mind. She had traveled nearly 200 miles to reach this place. Just a week earlier she had been standing on a crowded city street with nowhere to go after losing her job at a boarding house. Work had been scarce, and every door she knocked on seemed to close before she could even explain herself. When the letter offering a position at a mountain ranch arrived, it felt almost like a miracle. The job promised a small salary, a place to stay, and steady work helping around the house and land. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hope. Still, as Emma looked around the lonely mountain trail, she wondered if she had made the right decision. The carriage driver who had dropped her off hours earlier had simply pointed toward the trail and said, "Follow that path until you find Hayes Ridge Ranch." That had been nearly 3 miles ago. Now the road had narrowed into little more than a rocky path climbing toward the mist-covered peaks above. No houses, no fences, no signs of life at all. Emma picked up her satchel again and continued walking. The sound of wind moving through the tall pines created a soft whispering noise around her. Occasionally a bird fluttered between branches, but otherwise the mountain remained quiet and still. After another 10 minutes of walking, she stopped again, glancing uncertainly at the trail splitting around a large boulder. "Wonderful," she muttered to herself. "Now I'm lost." She turned slowly, studying both paths, when a distant sound reached her ears. Hoofbeats. Emma straightened quickly and looked down the trail behind her. At first she saw nothing except drifting fog between the trees. But then a dark shape slowly appeared through the mist. A horse. The animal moved steadily along the rocky path, its hooves landing confidently despite the uneven ground. Sitting tall in the saddle was a man wearing a weathered cowboy hat and a simple brown coat. He rode like someone who belonged in the mountains. As the horse approached, Emma noticed how calm both rider and animal seemed. The horse's dark mane swayed with each step, and the cowboy guided it easily with one hand resting loosely on the reins. He slowed when he spotted her standing beside the trail. "Well now," he said casually, his voice deep and relaxed, "don't see many travelers walking up this ridge." Emma felt slightly embarrassed under his curious gaze. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and gave a polite smile. "I'm looking for Hayes Ridge Ranch," she explained. The cowboy studied her for a moment, his eyes flicking to the small satchel in her hand and the dust on her travel dress. "That's so, yes, I was hired to work there." A faint grin appeared on his face. "Long walk from the main road." Emma sighed softly. The driver said it wasn't far. The cowboy chuckled under his breath. Drivers tend to say that when they don't feel like climbing the mountain themselves. Emma couldn't help smiling at that. He swung one leg over the saddle and climbed down from the horse with easy strength, landing lightly on the ground. Up close, he looked even more rugged, broad shoulders, sun-worn skin, and the calm confidence of someone used to long days outdoors. "You heading the right direction," he said after a moment. Relief spread across Emma's face. "Oh, thank goodness." The cowboy leaned casually against the saddle, glancing toward the fog-covered trail ahead. Still a ways to go though. Emma looked up the steep path disappearing into mist and sighed again. "Well," she said with a tired smile, "I suppose I'll get there eventually." The cowboy watched her quietly for a moment. Then he tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Daniel," he said. Emma nodded politely. Emma, at that moment, she believed she had simply met a friendly mountain cowboy on a lonely trail. She had no idea that the man standing beside her actually owned everything waiting beyond the ridge. Daniel walked beside his horse as Emma continued along the narrow trail, the rocky path winding steadily higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler with each step, and a light mist drifted between the tall pine trees, softening the distant ridges. Emma was grateful for the quiet company. The long journey had left her tired, and having someone who knew the mountain paths made the walk feel far less lonely. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft clop of the horse's hooves against stone and the wind whispering through the branches overhead. Emma finally glanced toward him. "You must work at the ranch," she said, trying to start a conversation. Daniel shrugged slightly, keeping one hand loosely on the reins. Something like that. She studied him briefly. His coat was simple, his boots worn, and his hat looked as though it had survived years of sun and rain. Nothing about him suggested wealth or importance. If anything, he looked like a man who spent long days working cattle or repairing fences. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "A while," he replied calmly. Emma laughed softly. "That doesn't sound very exact." Daniel smiled faintly but didn't answer. They continued climbing, the path growing steeper and narrower as it curved around large rocks and thick tree roots. After another few minutes Emma slowed down, placing a hand against her side as she caught her breath. Daniel noticed immediately. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice carried a hint of exhaustion. He glanced up the trail ahead. "You've still got a fair climb." Emma followed his gaze and sighed quietly. The mountain path stretched upward in a long curve disappearing into fog. "I suppose city life didn't prepare me for mountain roads," she admitted. Daniel chuckled. "That much is obvious." Emma raised an eyebrow at him but couldn't help smiling. He stepped toward the horse and patted its neck gently. "You ever ride?" "Not really." "Well," he said casually, "today might be a good time to start." Emma shook her head immediately. "Oh no, I couldn't take your horse." "You're not taking it," Daniel replied calmly. "Just borrowing half the saddle." Before she could protest further, he steadied the stirrup and motioned for her to climb up. Emma hesitated, glancing between the steep trail and the horse. "You're sure? Horse won't mind," he said. "And you'll reach the ranch before sunset." Reluctantly she placed her foot into the stirrup and allowed him to help her onto the saddle. His grip was strong but careful, lifting her easily into place. A moment later he swung up behind her in one smooth motion. Emma felt slightly awkward sitting in front of him, unsure where to place her hands. "Just hold the saddle," Daniel said, noticing her hesitation. The horse began moving again, climbing steadily along the mountain trail. From the higher vantage point, the view opened around them. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, revealing vast valleys below covered in forests and winding streams. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying the distant sound of rushing water somewhere far beneath the cliffs. Emma couldn't help staring in wonder. "I've never seen anything like this," she said softly. Daniel glanced toward the horizon. Mountains tend to surprise people. After nearly an hour of riding, the trees slowly thinned as they reached the ridge. Emma expected to see a small ranch house or perhaps a cluster of barns somewhere beyond the hill. Instead, the trail curved sharply around a massive rock wall. The horse stopped. Emma blinked in confusion. Standing before them were enormous iron gates built into a tall stone wall that stretched across the ridge. The metal bars were thick and elegant, decorated with intricate designs shaped like running horses. She stared in disbelief. "This can't be the ranch." Daniel nudged the horse forward. A guard standing beside the gates immediately straightened. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes." Emma froze. "Mr. Hayes." The heavy gates slowly opened with a deep metallic creak. Beyond them stretched a hidden valley filled with rolling pastures, massive barns, long wooden fences, and a grand house sitting proudly at the center of the estate. Emma's jaw slowly dropped. Daniel tipped his hat back slightly and smiled. "Welcome to Hayes Ridge Ranch." Emma sat frozen on the saddle as the horse walked slowly through the enormous iron gates. The sound of the metal closing behind them echoed across the valley, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were too busy taking in the breathtaking sight spread out before her. The hidden valley seemed to stretch for miles. Rolling green fields lay between gentle hills, dotted with hundreds of grazing horses and cattle. Large red barns stood near fenced pastures, and long wooden stables lined a wide dirt road that led deeper into the estate. Workers moved calmly across the land, tending animals, repairing fences, and guiding wagons loaded with supplies. It looked less like a ranch and more like an entire town built within the mountains. Emma slowly turned her head toward Daniel. "You didn't tell me this place was this big." Daniel gave a quiet chuckle behind her. "You didn't ask." The horse continued forward along the main road. As they passed, several ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully. "Afternoon, Mr. Hayes. Good ride today, sir." Each greeting made Emma blink in disbelief. They weren't speaking to him like an ordinary cowboy. They were speaking to him like a man in charge. Emma finally slid carefully off the horse when they reached the wide porch of the main house. Her boots touched the ground, but she still felt as if she were dreaming. The house in front of her was enormous, 3 stories tall with wide wooden porches wrapping around the sides. Tall windows reflected the afternoon sunlight, and climbing ivy-decorated parts of the stone walls. It looked more like a grand estate than anything she had expected in the mountains. Daniel swung down from the saddle and handed the reins to a young stable hand who hurried forward. "Take care of him," Daniel said. "Yes, sir." Emma stared at the stable hand, then back at Daniel. "You're really the owner?" she asked slowly. Daniel removed his hat and brushed a hand through his dark hair. "Name on the gates, isn't it?" Emma laughed nervously, still trying to process everything. "But you were walking the trail like any ordinary cowboy." "That's because I like walking the trail," he replied simply. Before Emma could respond, the front doors of the house opened and an older woman stepped onto the porch. She wore a neat dress and an apron, her gray hair tied back in a bun. "There you are, Daniel," she said warmly. "I was beginning to wonder if you got lost again." Daniel smiled slightly. "Just helping someone find the ranch." The woman's kind eyes turned toward Emma. "And you must be Miss Whitaker." Emma blinked in surprise. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Margaret," the woman said, stepping down the porch stairs. "I manage the house here." Emma glanced once more at the vast valley behind them, still amazed. "I thought I was coming to work at a small ranch," she admitted. Margaret chuckled softly. "Many people think that before they arrive." Daniel leaned casually against the porch railing, watching Emma's stunned expression with quiet amusement. She turned toward him again. "You knew I had no idea, didn't you?" He gave a small shrug. "You seemed happier thinking I was just a poor mountain cowboy." Emma crossed her arms, though a smile tugged at her lips. "Well, you certainly look like one." Daniel laughed. "Sometimes it's easier that way." Emma looked around the magnificent estate once more, the endless fields, the barns, the workers moving across the land. Her simple job had turned into something far greater than she ever imagined. And as she glanced back at Daniel Hayes, she had the strange feeling that coming to Hayes Ridge Ranch might change her life in ways she never expected.